Hello everybody and welcome back to Drums and Drams. My name is Cameron and today we have the very first episode of a new series that I'm starting called the Weekly Dram. Now, as the name suggests, this is going to be a weekly whiskey news recap show. What the heck does that mean? Well, throughout any given week, I am going to go through and collect different headlines and press releases of stuff that's going on in the world of whiskey. It could be Scotch, it could be American whiskey, or really anything. But what I'm doing is collecting these press releases and these headlines, sifting through all of it at the end of the week, kind of picking out maybe 4 to 6 items that I'd like to highlight here for all of you, stuff that I find interesting, stuff that I think the audience here might find interesting, and then not only recap what that news is, but also maybe give just a little bit of commentary on each item, basically just a way for you to kind of catch up on what happened throughout the week in the world of whiskey. And it's not going to be a tasting show or anything like that, but I wanted to ham it up. I wanted to make it a little silly, wear a suit, do the whole newscaster bit with my papers. But I think it's going to be a lot of fun from here on out. So let's go ahead and get right into it here. I have 5 items that I'd like to talk about on today's first episode of the Weekly Dram. For our first piece of news on today's show, we're going to go across the pond over to Scotland. This is coming out of the Macallan distillery, and it is the oldest whiskey that they've ever released. They announced just this week that they are bottling and selling an 81-year-old single malt Scotch whiskey. At 81 years old, that means this thing was distilled in 1940, right before the distillery shut down for World War II. That just sounds crazy to me. I can't imagine tasting something that old with that much history behind it. It seems like a really incredible feat for the Macallan. And so, again, it's just a really cool piece of news to come out this week. As you guys can see, this bottle is gorgeous. They have titled this whiskey The Reach. And as you can tell with this sort of bronze sculpture holding up this hand-blown glass decanter, The Reach is an appropriate name. All 3 of these hands have sort of a representative legacy behind them. You can read more about that online, but they really went all out on this release. It's a beautiful presentation, and it has a price to match. This is coming in at $125,000. So if you have, $1/8 of $1 million burning a hole in your pocket, and you'd like to get your hands on some really old Scotch whiskey, The Reach might just be the bottle for you. All right, so let's move on now. Let's come back to America for our second piece of news today. And this is coming to us from Blue Run Spirits. Many of you are going to be familiar with Blue Run. This is sort of an embattled brand thus far in the last couple of years that they've been operating and releasing bottles. They started off with some sourced stuff. Now they're starting to release their own distillate, and people often feel that it's overpriced and in some cases over-marketed. I'm still a little lukewarm on this. I'm just going to give them a little more time to kind of see how Blue Run develops, but that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're actually going to highlight the fact that Blue Run has added a new face to their team who is going to be considered their whiskey director. Now, this person is a veteran in the industry coming over from the Campari Group, so Wild Turkey, Russell's Reserve, and this is Shaylin Gammon. Now, as Blue Run's whiskey director, Gammon is going to work with the Blue Run team on the selection of sourced barrels for the company's bourbon and rye releases. She's going to prepare the company's private barrel selection program, which is pretty big news because we haven't seen any private barrels coming from Blue Run just yet, and also serve as the distillation apprentice to Blue Run liquid advisor Jim Rutledge, who many of you know as the former and sort of legendary master distiller from Four Roses. Exciting news from Blue Run Spirits. The fact that they're going to have a private barrel program along with the addition of Shaylin Gammon. Again, pretty cool stuff. All right, let's go ahead and move on now to Angel's Envy. Now, I'm not the biggest Angel's Envy fan. You can see I've got my rye whiskey up here, the finished rye, which I think is way too freaking sweet. It's a dessert whiskey for the holidays. That's basically the only time I drink this. But speaking of rye whiskeys, the next release in the Angel's Envy Cellar Collection, which is sort of a limited yearly release they do, the next release is going to be their very first rye whiskey in that collection. I've never tried any of the Cellar Collection bottlings, particularly because the price is pretty high, usually around $200 or $250 per bottle. But the fact that they're having a 7-year rye whiskey released here is pretty big news. It's a cool addition to the portfolio there. And this 7-year rye whiskey has been aged for an additional 364 days in ice cider casks. So we can expect a little additional apple influence there. I don't know if it's going to be as sweet as the finished rye over here, which again, I just think is way too sweet. But this will also be the highest proof release in the Cellar Collection thus far at 107 proof. And the bottle count is going to be about 6,000. So, pretty limited release there in that Cellar Collection. Let's move on now to the world of mixed martial arts, or MMA. I'm a big MMA fan. I grew up watching the UFC religiously with my dad. And along those same lines, there are other organizations like Bellator and the one we're going to be talking about today, the Professional Fighters League, or PFL. In the spirit of fighting, we have this sort of celebrity whiskey called Puncher's Chance that Bruce Buffer is sort of an ambassador for. He is the Octagon announcer for the UFC. But Puncher's Chance has just secured an official partnership with the PFL, the Professional Fighters League. So this is going to be their official whiskey. Just a little something I wanted to call out there. I actually think Puncher's Chance is some pretty darn good stuff. It's young, yes. I think 4, 5, 6 years old, something around there. But it's really good whiskey and at a great value. Widely available, nice and affordable, kind of in that Russell's 10-year price point range. And I think it's a pretty good option for something that's sort of a celebrity whiskey. If I recall, I think they just released a 12-year age-dated product. It would have to be sourced from somewhere, but I'm going to have to check that out and see if I can get my hands on one of those. Okay, to wrap up today's show, the final bit of news is coming out of Maker's Mark. Admittedly, I am not the biggest Maker's Mark fan. I've got my FAE02 here. And speaking of FAE02 and the wood finishing series, this is really the only thing that's made me kind of a Maker's Mark fanboy recently. I love what they're doing with the wood finishing series. I don't know why it resonates with me so much better than kind of the standard release or the 46 or 46 cask strength, but I love it. And that is a perfect tie-in to the final bit of news here, which is the 2022 Maker's Wood Finishing announcement. They all have these crazy acronyms on them, and the new one is BRT, which stands for Barrel Rotation. We are going to see 2 releases this year. It's not formally announced, but we can imagine it's going to be in the spring and in the fall. So we get BRT01 and BRT02. This stands for Barrel Rotation. And what it means is they're first going to highlight what the barrels and the tops of the rick houses, what kind of characteristics those have, because they do rotate their barrels. And the BRT02 release is going to highlight the lower floors of the rick houses. Now, for the BRT01 release, there has been a TTB filing. We do see what the label looks like here. Tasting notes, deep caramelized barrel notes, accented with some toastiness and a warm finish. Sounds delicious. Proof 110.6. I'm sure it's going to vary. That's just a TTB filing thing. And the stave details are 10 virgin toasted American oak, which sounds pretty darn familiar to FAE01. So I'm going to be curious to see what this BRT01 is like, and especially BRT02 with, I'm sure, an end of the year comparison here on the channel. Guys, that's all I've got today for the first episode of the Weekly Dram. Thank you so much for tuning in and checking it out. Let me know what you think about this in the comments below, if it's totally ridiculous or if you enjoyed it. I'd be curious to hear what you all think. Please like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel, turn on all notifications to find out when I'm going live and when I'm dropping new content. If you want to help support the channel and get access to some exclusive behind-the-scenes bonus content, you can always check out Drums and Drams on Patreon. There are some affordable tiers there for everybody. Otherwise, I'm going to get out of here. I've got a show to go play tonight, actually, a concert to go play. I need to be there and on stage in 25 minutes. So I am getting out of here. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week here on the Weekly Dram.